I started out my career in summer stock doing comedy, and I played a lot of heavies, and I got killed by a lot of people and killed a lot of people. Then I went straight when I did Moving On, and now we've come full circle. I get to do a comedy again.
Claude Akins was Hollywood's favorite tough guy, the growling villain audiences loved to hate, and the sheriff they somehow rooted for anyway. On screen, he died more times than almost anyone in the business, taking bullets, punches, and betrayals across 4 decades of film and television. Off-screen, almost nobody actually knew him. Now, piecing together his war record, his marriage, and the interviews he rarely gave, the full picture of Claude Akins is finally coming together. Stick around, because his double life was hiding in plain sight the whole time. The tough guy America couldn't stop watching. Claude Marion Akins built an entire career out of being the guy you loved to hate, or sometimes the guy you were relieved to see walk into a room. He had that deep, booming voice and that broad-shouldered frame, and directors kept handing him roles that needed menace, authority, or both at once. Can you imagine building a 40-year career almost entirely out of playing other people's worst days? His first real break came in 1953, when he stepped in front of the camera for From Here to Eternity, the Oscar-winning drama that swept that year's Academy Awards. It wasn't a lead role, but it put him in a film with Burt Lancaster and Montgomery Clift, and that was enough to get Hollywood paying attention. From there, things moved fast. He played a seaman alongside Humphrey Bogart in The Caine Mutiny, and by the end of the decade, he'd landed one of his most memorable roles yet, the sneering, dangerous Joe Burdette in Rio Bravo, starring opposite John Wayne. That performance alone would have made most actors' careers, but for Akins, it was just one stop on a much longer road. He kept working through the 50s and 60s in an almost unbelievable string of westerns and dramas, appearing in The Defiant Ones with Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis, Inherit the Wind as the fire and brimstone Reverend Jeremiah Brown, and Merrill's Marauders as the gritty Sergeant Kolowitz. By his own count, and this is wild if you think about it, he estimated he'd racked up close to 1,000 on-screen deaths between the war films and the villain roles he took on. 1,000. That's not a typo. On top of the feature films, Akins was constantly showing up on the small screen too, guest starring across shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Maverick, Perry Mason, Cheyenne, Have Gun Will Travel, and The Adventures of Superman, sometimes appearing in 3 or 4 different series within a single television season. That kind of pace wasn't unusual for character actors of his generation, but few managed to stay that consistently in demand for as long as he did. Directors knew that whatever the script called for, whether it was a corrupt lawman, a battle-hardened sergeant, or a small-town preacher losing his grip, Akins would show up and deliver it without complaint. He even ventured briefly into a stranger corner of television during the early 1970s, taking on no-nonsense sheriff roles in the supernatural thrillers The Night Stalker and The Norliss Tapes, proving he could ground even the strangest, most outlandish scripts with a sense of believable authority. Whatever the genre, whatever the budget, Akins brought the same steady, commanding presence that made him so easy to cast again and again. Then came 1973, and something genuinely strange happened. Akins disappeared entirely under ape makeup to play General Aldo, the war-hungry gorilla leading a rebellion in battle for the planet of the apes. Fans who'd spent 20 years watching his face on screen suddenly couldn't recognize him at all. And somehow, that fit him perfectly. He was always the guy who could vanish into a role. But here's where the story actually gets interesting, because just 1 year later, Akins did something nobody expected. He swapped the villain roles for something warmer entirely, stepping into the boots of Sonny Pruitt, a good-hearted long-haul trucker in the series Movin' On, which ran from 1974 to 1976. Suddenly, the man who'd played killers and con men for 2 decades was somebody families invited into their living rooms every week. That shift set up the role that would define his later career more than any other. In 1979, he stepped into B.J. and the Bear as the bumbling, lovable Sheriff Elroy P. Lobo, a character so popular that it spun off into its own show, The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo, which ran until 1981. The tough guy from Rio Bravo had somehow become the goofy small-town sheriff everyone couldn't help but laugh at. Along the way, he also picked up smaller but memorable turns, showing up as Ben Lane in Comanche Station opposite Randolph Scott, as Seeley Jones in A Distant Trumpet with Troy Donahue, and as Private Rocky Rockman in The Devil's Brigade, a role that let him flex the same gruff, battle-worn energy his own military service had given him firsthand. Even decades into his career, he kept popping up in unexpected places, including a recurring turn as fisherman Ethan Cragg on Murder, she wrote alongside Angela Lansbury. What's wild is that the full breakdown of his career on Wikipedia shows just how deep and varied that filmography actually ran. Yet most casual fans only ever knew him from 1 or 2 signature roles. And that transformation right there? That's the first piece of the double life nobody talks about. The screen villain and the screen sweetheart were the exact same man, and somehow audiences barely noticed the switch. The man behind 1,000 deaths. So who was this guy before Hollywood ever knew his name? Claude Akins was born on May 25, 1926, in the small town of Nelson, Georgia. And by the time he was 6 months old, his family had already relocated to Bedford, Indiana, the town that would end up shaping most of who he became. His father worked as a police officer, and that early exposure to discipline and quiet authority would echo for decades in the characters Akins eventually played. When World War II broke out, Akins didn't hesitate. He joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps and served overseas in Burma and the Philippines, reaching the rank of Master Sergeant before his discharge. That's not a detail Hollywood publicists usually dream up. That's a real young man from small-town Indiana heading straight into one of the most brutal theaters of the entire war. When he came home, something in him had shifted toward the stage. He enrolled at Northwestern University, majoring in speech and theater, and graduated in 1949 as a member of the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. From there, he trained at the Barter Theater in Abingdon, Virginia, touring in productions like The Hasty Heart and Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors, learning his craft the hard way, night after night, in front of live audiences instead of cameras. By 1951, Akins had made his way to Broadway, landing a small, uncredited role in Tennessee Williams' The Rose Tattoo alongside Maureen Stapleton and Eli Wallach. It wasn't a starring turn by any stretch, but it put him in the room with some of the most respected actors of the era, and it planted the seed for everything that came next. Anyone curious about those early years can find a detailed account of his path from Bedford High School to the Barter Theater over at INSP. And what stands out most is how methodical he was about the craft long before Hollywood ever came calling. He wasn't chasing fame in those years. He was just building skill, one regional production at a time. The same steady, unglamorous way plenty of character actors of that generation earned their stripes. Once the film and television roles started rolling in, Akins never really stopped working. Between roughly 100 films, more than half of them westerns, and over 180 television episodes, he built a reputation as one of the most reliable working actors in the business. He even had a phrase for it, calling himself the highest-paid unknown in Hollywood, which honestly might be the most Claude Akins thing he ever said. Here's something people rarely bring up when they talk about his career. Despite playing so many hardened, threatening characters, colleagues and directors consistently described him off-camera as gregarious, warm, and easy to work with, a description that shows up again and again in his own IMDb biography. The tough guy on screen and the tough guy off screen were basically strangers to each other. Late in his career, Claude Akins often laughed about the staggering number of characters he'd killed on screen. In interviews, he joked that he had probably left around 1,000 bodies behind over the years, thanks to his countless war films, westerns, crime dramas, and the intimidating villains he portrayed. He even quipped that he'd taken plenty of other characters down with him along the way. It was a humorous way of acknowledging just how remarkably busy his career had been. After all, few actors spent decades playing such a wide range of soldiers, sheriffs, outlaws, gangsters, and larger-than-life tough guys. Audiences came to associate him with danger, authority, and physical intimidation. Yet those who knew him away from the cameras consistently described someone completely different. Friends, colleagues, and family members remembered a kind, approachable man with a generous spirit and an easygoing personality that stood in stark contrast to the fearsome figures he portrayed. That striking contrast between the ruthless men he played and the genuinely warm person he was made his life all the more fascinating. But if you thought his career was the only place Akins was quietly living two different lives, wait until you hear what he was keeping hidden within the walls of his own home for years. The private world he never let cameras into.
Here's where things get genuinely surprising, because while Claude Akins was busy building one of the most recognizable faces in American television, almost nobody knew what his actual home life looked like. He kept it locked down tight, and honestly, in an industry built on exposure, that's almost its own kind of rebellion. In August 1952, Akins married Therese Fairfield, whom friends and family affectionately called Pi. That marriage lasted 42 years, all the way until his death in 1994. And across that entire span, the two of them raised 3 children together: Claude Marion Jr., Michelle, and Wendy. 42 years in an industry where marriages rarely survive? The first decade is worth sitting with for a second. What's remarkable is how little of that life ever made it into interviews or magazine profiles. Akins was, by every account, a deeply private man who drew a hard line between his career and his family. And he apparently meant it, because there's shockingly little public record of his home life beyond the basic facts of his marriage and children. In a business obsessed with tabloids and gossip columns, Akins simply refused to play along. You can see that same restraint reflected in how his broader profile documents his career and service record in far more depth than his personal life, which lines up with everything former colleagues and biographers have said about the man. He gave the cameras his craft and his voice, but he kept the actual texture of his day-to-day family life almost entirely to himself. Even the basic milestones of his household stayed relatively quiet by celebrity standards. His son Claude Marion Jr. and daughters Michelle and Wendy grew up largely outside the spotlight, and there's no evidence Akins ever tried to leverage his fame to build a public brand around his family the way plenty of his contemporaries did. That choice, deliberate and consistent for over 4 decades, says almost as much about his character as any role he ever played. There's also a quieter thread running through his story that connects back to his roots. Akins carried part Cherokee heritage, and in 1986,
He was honored as the Outstanding Indian and Native American of the Year at the American Indian Exposition in Oklahoma. That recognition doesn't get nearly enough attention when people talk about his legacy, but it clearly meant something to him personally. Away from the cameras, Akins reportedly leaned into his Christian faith and stayed devoted to his family in a way that rarely made headlines, precisely because he made sure it didn't. He wasn't chasing tabloid coverage or working the interview circuit to build a public persona around his marriage. He just lived it quietly for over 4 decades, while his on-screen self kept dying 1,000 different ways for paying audiences. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that kind of discipline is in Hollywood. Plenty of actors talk about wanting privacy, but very few actually manage to protect it for the length of an entire career. Akins pulled it off almost completely, to the point that even now, decades after his death, biographers have far more material to work with on his filmography than on his actual home life. That imbalance alone tells you everything about which version of his life he considered worth protecting. So on one side, you've got the villain, the sheriff, the general, the gunfighter, the guy audiences thought they understood completely. And on the other side, you've got a devoted husband and father of 3 who spent over 40 years almost entirely out of the public eye. 2 completely different existences running side by side, and barely anyone connecting the dots until now. That contrast is stark enough on its own, but it becomes even more meaningful once you understand how Akins spent his final years, and how the truth about the man behind the roles finally started coming together. The truth fans are only now piecing together. By the early 1990s, Claude Akins was still working, still showing up on screen the way he had for nearly 4 decades. In 1991, he appeared in an episode of In the Heat of the Night titled An Eye for an Eye, playing a character named Benjamin Sloan, marking what would end up being one of his final television roles. Not long after, Akins was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and he passed away on January 27, 1994, in Altadena, California, at the age of 67. Just like that, more than 40 years of steady, prolific work came to an end, and the industry lost one of its most dependable character actors, even if his name was never quite as famous as his face. Some of the clearest breakdowns of just how extensive that career really was, nearly 100 films, more than half of them westerns, and well over 180 television episodes across 4 decades, are laid out in a fuller retrospective of his life, family, and career, which also touches on the modest fortune he built from all that steady, unglamorous work. He was never chasing blockbuster paydays. He was simply always working, which in its own way was its own kind of quiet ambition. What's happened in the years since his death is almost its own kind of quiet revelation. Piece by piece, through old interviews, biographical sketches, and the occasional tribute article, fans have slowly started stitching together just how private Akins really was, and how deliberately he separated his public image from his personal life. It wasn't scandal or secrecy in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and, honestly, kind of admirable. A man who simply chose not to let Hollywood define every part of who he was. His hometown of Bedford, Indiana, hasn't forgotten him either. Every year over Labor Day weekend, the town holds the Claude Akins Memorial Golf Classic, with proceeds going toward the Akins Scholarship for graduating seniors at Bedford North Lawrence High School, along with support for local recreation projects, a tradition that continues to be documented and celebrated by local historians to this day. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't come from fame alone. That comes from a community that genuinely loved who he was, even the parts of him they never got to see on screen. And that's really the heart of the story here. Claude Akins lived 2 lives running in parallel for over 4 decades. The snarling villain and steady lawman audiences thought they knew, and the quiet, devoted husband and father almost nobody got to see. He estimated close to 1,000 deaths across his on-screen career. Yet the one part of his life he protected most fiercely, his marriage, his kids, his faith, never once made the headlines while he was alive. It took decades after his passing for fans to really start connecting those 2 versions of Claude Akins into one complete picture. The tough guy from Rio Bravo and the goofy Sheriff Lobo were never really opposites. They were both just performances, layered on top of a private, deeply grounded man who spent over 40 years quietly building a life his fans never got to witness. And maybe that's the real reason his story still resonates. In an era where every celebrity marriage, every family milestone, and every personal struggle gets dissected online within hours, Claude Akins managed to do the opposite for his entire adult life. He gave audiences everything on screen: the menace, the warmth, the 1,000 deaths, the goofy small-town sheriff, and kept the one thing that mattered most to him almost entirely off the record. That's the truth that's finally coming out, one piece at a time, and honestly, it might be more compelling than anything he ever played on screen. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.